Hey everybody, welcome back for another Make and Tell Tuesday. Today I'm going to be creating a card that combines a few of my favorite trends from this season. We're going to be using cotton, buffalo plaid, and some pine. Alright, so to start off, I'm going to be stamping the cotton branches from the Cotton Comfort set, and I am going to set those up in my MISTI and go ahead and stamp those, and I'm going to be using a few different colors here. I'm going to be using frayed burlap, antique linen, and vintage photo. I'm going to be skipping this base layer because I want to keep my cotton nice and bright and white, and so I'm going to skip that layer, leave it white on my die cuts, and then I'll just be stamping the shading area of those instead. So I'll go ahead and set up my MISTI. I have my sticky mat in my MISTI, which is how I like to use it. I've talked about that before. This is a Cricut mat that I cut and put in here to keep my die cuts in place. And I'll go ahead and stamp the steps and move my die cut around my mat as I go. So there's our finished cotton branch, which turned out really pretty. And we're going to go ahead and now we're going to work on the pine needles. So I have several pine needle sections cut, and these were die cut using the Botanica's pine bough die. And so I cut those from kind of a bright citrusy yellowish green, and so I'm going to add some shading now using evergreen bough and pine needles, distress oxide inks. And just to add some color and some shading, I purposely chose two different types of green to use to do this, as far as the color of the green that I die cut the needles from and versus the color of ink that I'm going to be shading them with. It just provides a really nice contrast and a lot of interest in those needles. Rather than choosing two colors that are very similar to each other, it just gives a little more contrast and interest and realism to those needles. So I'll just go ahead and ink those up. I'm placing those onto a little section of a Cricut cutting mat. I've talked about these many times in my videos. I like to use them, like I said earlier, in my MISTI, but then I also use those, I use the leftover pieces that I've cut from cutting them down to use in my MISTI. I'll keep those and use those for things like this, where I can stick a detailed die cut onto that mat, and it just makes it easier to work with. Keeps some of those finer points and little bits and pieces in place so that I can sponge those with ink or even watercolor them, whatever I want to do with them. It just kind of helps keep things in place. Okay, so now we have several pine needle portions all inked up and ready to go that we can use on our card. I also have a little pine cone that we're going to incorporate into this project. This was cut from craft cardstock and then colored with colored pencils using the method that I showed in the last Make and Tell Tuesday video. In that video I used a white pine cone and we just did some real subtle shading. This time I used the same technique, but I used a little bit darker colored pencils and the craft cardstock. So now we're going to add a little buffalo plaid background to our cotton and our pine needles. And we're going to do that by doing some masking and some sponging onto a Cozy Cup coaster die cut. I've already die cut this from red cardstock, and so we can go ahead and do our inking to create our plaid pattern. You'll notice on the Cozy Cup coaster die there is a pierced pattern in the center. So we're going to use that as our guide for creating our plaid. So I'm just going to be using some post-it notes to do some easy masking, and also I have Black Soot Distress Oxide ink, And so what we're going to do is we're just going to move along. We're going to mask off, we're going to place a post-it note right along those pierced lines so that we have a strip here that we can sponge with our black soot ink. And then we'll just continue doing that and building our plaid. So we're going to ink every other stripe. And so we'll leave one red. So we'll move this post-it note right here and put that along that pierced line. And then we'll do another one right here. And as we go along, we're going to have to add another post-it note to cover the width, as our strips get a little longer as we go along, of course, along the diagonal. So we'll just kind of accommodate for that as we go along. Alright, so now we have one side finished. Now we're going to go ahead and switch our post-it notes and we're going to ink the opposite direction, the opposite diagonals. So we'll go this way and we'll finish off the plaid. Okay, so we've made it all the way across both directions of the diagonal and we've created this really fun plaid background piece that we can use with our cotton and our pine needles. Alright, so now we have all of these really pretty elements that we can go ahead and use on a card, and I've kind of decided on this arrangement. I also added some chunky glitter to my pine needle branches using this Wow Chunky White glitter from American Crafts. And I also stamped a sentiment, and this is also from the Cotton Comfort set using the matching die from the die set. And then I stamped the Warm Hello, which is also from Cotton Comforts, and that is stamped on the little strip from the Sentiment Sweet Basics die set. So I've kind of decided on this arrangement, and so I'm going to go ahead and add that to a craft card base. Alright, so I have that pretty well all arranged and attached, except for my sentiments. And before I attach those, I want to add a whole bunch of white splatters, kind of to create a snowy effect. So I'm going to do that before I add that sentiment. And I'm going to be using my favorite white ink, which is Amsterdam acrylic white ink. And I just like to take a wet paintbrush and dip that right in my ink and then tap that just to create some nice splatters. You can do as much or as little as you'd like. Splatters just add so much fun and covers a multitude of sins if you have any little mistakes or little ink splatters, stray ink pieces from stamping, or anything else. Splatters can just cover that all up. Okay, so I think that's looking pretty good, and then we can just go ahead and attach our sentiment and it's finished. Alright, so it's all finished, and that wraps up our project today for this week's Make and Tell Tuesday. Thanks for joining me, everybody. Have a great week.